From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director. You can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. On today's program, we'll be talking about the war in Ukraine, both on the battlefield and online. Since Russia launched its invasion on February 24th, the war has dominated headlines, and the impact has been immediate and severe, resulting in massive refugee outflows and untold damage to Ukrainians' lives and livelihoods. We'll be discussing Russia's military and cyber campaign, the bigger picture implications, and where things might be headed going forward. There's a lot to discuss, but we're lucky to have two excellent guests on the program with us today, Chris Kubecka and Iulia Joja. Chris is the Distinguished Chair of MEI's Cyber Program and the founder and CEO of HIPAASEC. Iulia is the director of MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative and of the Afghanistan Watch Project. Chris, Iulia, welcome back to the program, and thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Iulia, it's been just over a week since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. Where do things stand more broadly, and what have been your key takeaways so far?
Yes, it's been a very difficult week, and I think it's safe to say that it hasn't affected just the region, Eastern Europe, but really the world. I keep hearing people who express anxiety here in DC and across Europe, and I think it's going wider than that. And I guess the most stressful element for people is the fact that we are dealing with an invasion from Russia under a regime that is increasingly dictatorial, something that the West hadn't anticipated, that the West had underestimated. And many people were surprised by this invasion. And then on the other side, we have Ukraine, a country of significant size and geopolitical importance, who is fighting and making ultimate sacrifices for their freedom, their independence, and their right to determine whether they can join the West or not. And I think this element, the political and the social element, are the things that we see people affecting most. The incredible bravery of the Zelensky government, the Ukrainian people, how well and over exaggerating any good hopes that people had for them to resist, going against them and proving that they are there to fight, they are there to resist an aggression and a military invasion from, in the end, a nuclear superpower. So I think this is the way that I would frame this conflict, how incredibly aggressive and atrocious the Russian invasion has been from such a powerful actor, and what Ukraine stands for in their fight right now.
Chris, Russia has a pretty notorious history when it comes to carrying out cyber attacks in Ukraine, and there was a lot of speculation about how that side of things might play out in the event of a conflict. What are you actually seeing on the cyber front so far, and what's been most noteworthy or surprising for you?
Well, some of the things that I've seen are attacks against water facilities in the east, which may or may not be a way for Russia to tell its public that the Ukrainian government has carried out things such as, atrocities and so forth and affecting everyday living in the East by cutting off water supplies. We've also seen banking being hit throughout the country on a repeated basis, and a series of what are called wiper viruses, more specifically hermetic wiper virus that has been going through various government entities in the Ukraine. The most notable so far that has stuck out in my mind is something that I actually witnessed, and it was when I was trying to cross the border from the Ukraine to Romania. The border control on the Ukrainian side was hit with one of these wiper viruses where they had told me that all of their data was gone. And this had added to the chaos and to the backlog of people at the border waiting to get through. And recently, the CEO of Microsoft came out and called the border control attack on the Ukraine side as a violation of the Geneva Conventions, because it's one of these things that has slowed down evacuation and the movement of refugees to the point where it's causing great deal of suffering at the border. I mean, some borders you can wait days. And if you think you can walk across, it'll be quicker. You're stuck standing in the freezing cold all night or all day. And it's caused a lot of issues. So we're now seeing how cyber used as a weapon can cause such suffering.
Chris, just following up on that, do you think Russia's cyber attacks against Ukraine might set a new precedent for what is and is not acceptable when it comes to cyber warfare?
Well, I think so. And when hopefully all this is done and over with and there's a positive outcome for the Ukrainian people, I think a lot more things are going to be public because right now we're in the midst of a war or a crisis. And even official numbers of how many troops have died are kind of a closely guarded secret, but so are some of the cyber attacks that are hitting Ukraine. And I think it will define what is those definitions of, say, cyber warfare moving forward. There's also been discussions of expanding, for example, the Geneva Conventions and other conventions and agreements and treaties to include that cyber element.
Chris, the world is watching Ukraine, and do you think that other actors, particularly in the Middle East, are likely to take cues from what they're seeing happen on the cyber front?
Well, I think they are, because already in the Middle East, both internal countries like Iran and external countries such as Russia have already been using the Middle East as a testing ground because sanctions aren't as taken seriously by, say, the Emiratis or the Saudis as they are when you have sanctions either by the US or now the level of sanctions that have been against Russia. And I think we should continue to watch the Middle East closely because of its use of being a cyber testing ground, because of the way that applications of sanctions are a bit unequal if you don't have world support.
Yulia, on the ground, we've seen Russia's military tactics evolve after some pretty significant early setbacks. Given what we know about the Russian military playbook, especially from the conflict in Syria, what do you expect to see going forward?
That's a very good question. And I think there are several scenarios that military experts, far more versed than me, are taking into account. And I'm trying to follow all of those and make sense of those compared to also a backlog, we have to say, of Russian military aggression in Eastern Europe. We know Syria as one of the most atrocious interventions that Russia has made over the last few years. But in Eastern Europe, too, we have a long history before the end of the Soviet Union, and then later on into the now so-called frozen conflicts in Georgia, in Moldova, then 2008, Georgia again, 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine. And so with this pattern, unfortunately, the scenarios look very, very dark. We've seen over the last few days ferocious, atrocious attacks, indiscriminate attacks against civilians in Ukraine, such as we have seen them before in Syria and in other places. If we go back in military history, Putin's first war is that of Chechnya in 1999, when we have seen the horrendous things that can happen to civilians when Putin is in power. With all this knowledge in mind, the scenarios on the ground are nevertheless limited, I would say. We know from Ukrainian intelligence published and confirmed by US intelligence that most of the military capabilities that Russia had committed to the conflict in Ukraine on the three sides, so from the Russian border, from the Belarus border, and from the Black Sea, the majority of these have been committed, particularly when it comes to land forces. When it comes to naval forces and air power, we have not seen yet. We know that in the first few days, and that's been a big surprise to us watching the military sphere, that precision strikes from Russia have not been successful. And overall, we've seen particularly when we're looking at the land forces, that their preparedness and the way they operate and the way they communicate is highly problematic. I don't think many people expected Russian military capabilities to show such big setbacks. But we also have to keep in mind that Russia has committed only part of its forces. It has a huge arsenal of conventional weapons. It is about to, rumors are, impose martial law in Russia to be able to get more conscripts involved in the conflict in Ukraine. And so, with that, there's much uncertainty in terms of what can happen. We know from the conflict in Syria also that Russia has at least indirectly been involved in the use of weapons that are just disastrous, including chemical weapons. And so these are still options that Russia has on the table. And if someone asks the question, and I see that in the social media, in the conventional media space, people sort of trying to calm themselves by making the argument that Russia will not be using such atrocious measures and weapons in Ukraine. To that, I have to say the track record is not promising. We already have information that they have used some of the very problematic weapons, and there's these reports coming out, including vis-a-vis how they treat their own citizens, from civilians protesting in Russia to military forces on the ground, including with reports that injured Russian soldiers are being shot instead of taken away from the front and taken care of. So with that backlog sort of how Russia is treating civilians and militaries involved in a conflict, I fear that we have not seen the worst yet.
Iulia, the speed with which the US, EU, and NATO have responded to the Russian invasion has been pretty remarkable, all things considered. Nevertheless, given the dire nature of the situation, there's a huge need for more to be done pretty much across the board. What should be the top priorities right now?
That's a very good question. And I think a lot more can be done on several fronts. I guess the biggest decision has been this decision with ample sanctions, but these sanctions are not bulletproof, so to speak. So we know that we have, first of all, imposed sanctions that have not worked. And we know that they cannot deter Putin's military and strategic decisions. However, they can have a medium and long-term effect in Russia with regards to the Russian population, including the elites. So we have to consider putting, and this is in the making in the EU and in the larger Western space, more sanctions on the table, harsher, including something that will have major consequences for the Europeans in terms of their sacrifices, a decoupling of energy from the European side towards Russia. When it comes to sanctions specifically, the second thing that I think needs to be seriously planned and implemented in the near future are secondary sanctions, a similar scenario that we have seen in cases such as Iran in the past. Secondary sanctions on those who work with Russia can be efficient, as well as decoupling energy in terms of major effects on deterring the Putin regime. This is on the civilian side of sanctions, if you'd like. On the issues on the ground, there are a lot more things that we can do vis-a-vis helping Ukraine specifically. In terms of humanitarian responses, we've seen amazing responses from EU countries bordering Ukraine, particularly Poland has played sort of the leadership role in taking on refugees and being very well organized. But other countries across Europe are stepping up too. But we know that Ukrainians need a lot more humanitarian aid. We also know that they need a lot more military aid. Indeed, it's been over the last week or so a watershed or several watershed moments for European powers in their decision to deliver weapons to Ukraine so that Ukrainians can defend themselves. But we also know that these are too little and too late. So a lot more needs to be done, both openly and covertly, to aid Ukrainians in their fight and in their defense of the country, from weapons to real time intelligence sharing.
Chris, what are the big picture geopolitical implications of the kind of cyber warfare we're seeing Russia carry out in Ukraine? And are you worried about potential threats to U.S. cybersecurity?
Well, I think some of the big picture things are the fact that Russia was the country that blocked UNGCC group, let's see, in 2015, from agreeing to what was the definition of cyber warfare for the UN. I think we are going to get that definition when it comes to the Ukrainian Russian war that we're seeing right now because of some of the things that have been done already. And when it comes to, are there threats to, for instance, US cybersecurity? I would absolutely say yes. We're already seeing, as of yesterday morning, the Dutch press and Netherlands language reporting that our security services were able to halt an attack by Russia on the country's internet routers. And this has also occurred with various other cyber attacks now attributed to Russia and Sweden and Latvia right now that are ongoing. With the use of a wiper virus, to give our listeners a background, 10 years ago almost, a wiper virus was used against Saudi Aramco by the Iranian government, and it knocked them back. So far, it destroyed over 30,000 computer systems, and the world's most valuable company at the time, worth over, I really don't know how many trillions, they were using pencil and paper, and they had to go out to storage and get older computer equipment and fax machines to try to get back up and running while things were being restored. And we're starting to see similar things in the Ukraine with the use of wiper viruses coming out of Russia and being fully attributed to Russia. So we're seeing that countries that are agreeing to sanctions and are pushing and behind pushing various sanctions are now starting to feel the brunt of that a bit through cyber attacks out of Russia.
And if I can follow up with that, back to you, Chris. First of all, shout out! You're in my home country, so I'm glad you're safe now and made it out of Ukraine into what is my hometown, Bucharest, Romania. But I'm glad you're bringing this up and explaining this to help us make sense of what is happening in terms of cyber warfare and what the West is facing. We've seen reports of cyber warfare already spreading over a week ago into NATO territory. And we've also seen particularly NATO responding to that with a possibility of a NATO country being able to launch Article 5 of NATO. To our listeners, as a background, NATO Article 5 does not mean necessarily a military action, but it is a collective way of defense proportional to the threat that NATO is facing. That's a real possibility that has been discussed. So I'm curious to hear from you, Chris, and your work. Do you think that NATO countries are prepared, if such a scenario would arise, are prepared to follow up with collective defense? And what would that look like in terms of cyber against Russia?
Well, I think at this point they probably will be in agreement to declare Article 5 if the cyber attacks actually cause harm to the point of loss of life in a NATO country. We've also seen a few NATO countries, such as the UK and the Netherlands, come out publicly stating that they are prepared to use offensive cybersecurity tactics against the Russians if they are attacked. And I think this is quite both stunning and something that really should have been prepared for a little bit more in advance, because this shadow of Russia has been a shadow for a bit too long when it comes to the rest of Europe. there are many countries that have capabilities of offensive cybersecurity. The US is rather famous for theirs as a NATO country with what they call active defense, which is kind of a little bit offensive anyway to actively defend their cyber borders. Most of the other NATO countries do not have that, with the outlier being the Netherlands, where they legalized the ability for the Dutch government to hack any device anywhere in the world. So they already have the legal framework to do so, to launch offensive cybersecurity operations, also as a NATO member, against Russia if they are attacked again. So I think that what we're looking at is if there can be a proven case of loss of human life or loss to critical services, then I think that's going to be the thing that pushes NATO into Article 5.
We're running short on time, but before we wrap up, I wanted to give you both a final chance to weigh in with any last thoughts. Maybe starting with you, Chris.
Well, I think we need to watch closely what is going on when it comes to both physical aggression, but also cyber aggression in this particular crisis. And with that, also what I would call the hacktivist involvement as well. Because even if there are countries that don't really want to participate too much in this conflict, there are various groups. I belong to one that I'm looking at. It has over 230,000 people in the Ukrainian IT army from all around the world participating and launching various different types of cyber attacks against Russia. And one thing that needs to be looked at very carefully is to not look like a country is, say, allowing this and actually actively participating in cyber operations. It would be wise for various countries to keep an eye out to make sure that their citizens don't do something that could also be devastating cyber-wise and affect human life or critical infrastructure in Russia. So it's a very interesting thing to watch right now.
Iulia, you've got the final word.
Thank you, Alistair. I want to build on some of what Chris was concluding on. To me, one of the most interesting phenomena that has taken place over the last week or so since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been the power of the people. Chris has highlighted that in terms of groups and huge numbers of participants in non-state institutions, virtual institutions in this conflict. And I do believe on the political, social, economic side, the fact that we have seen these mass protests, particularly in Europe, in European capitals, but also support around the world, has been one of the key factors for why the West has been, if late, nevertheless resolute in their response. That, together with what is going on in social media, where you see some of the brightest people participating with creative ideas in how to help Ukrainians and how to push back against Russia and defend freedom in the end. So this is something that I'm heartened to see and I'm watching out for. And this is maybe also food for thought for our listeners in terms of what we can do, each one of us on our little piece of work, to be supportive of Ukraine and help push back against these atrocities that are taking place right now caused by Putin's regime.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but we'll be watching this issue very, very closely. And Iulia, Chris, thank you both for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Alistair.
Thank you so much, Alistair.
That was Iulia Sabina Joja and Chris Kubecka. You can follow all of our coverage of the Ukraine conflict and its broader implications on our website at www.mei.edu. That's all the time we have this week. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in and to our production team for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Alistair Taylor. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.